I mentioned recently the outrageous opinion that I believe Edgar Allan Poe's modus operandi was to steal poetry from grieving widowers, people who normally had no intentions of being literary figures, who didn't publish, but who, under the stress of grief, could sometimes rise to the occasion and write some pretty good poetry. And Poe presumably would visit with them and sympathize and read their poetry and ask for a copy, and then he would plagiarize it. So that is what I believe he was attempting to do with Matthew Franklin Whittier, except he didn't realize what kind of a bird he had caught, because Matthew was, a better literary figure than he was, but incognito, see? So that's why The Raven was so incredibly good. It wasn't an accident. So I'm going to prove this, or at least give some pretty strong evidence. I'm going to show you that Poe definitely plagiarized the work of different kinds of grieving widowers. See, it's not consistent. And this all came about for me when somebody challenged me, well, have you read Poe's poetry? And I had not. So I went back and looked at every single poem that Poe published up to 1843, because in 1842, I believe he shared The Raven and Annabel Lee with Poe. So I wanted to see what he had written up to that time. And what I found, because it's my understanding that Poe was a real sociopath, as I've said. So he could not have been religious, not sincerely. He couldn't have been sincerely spiritual, which I consider the esoteric side of religion is the deeper side, in my opinion. He couldn't have been, a sincerely devotional Christian or a sincerely spiritual person. He couldn't have sincerely believed in the other side and in the tenets of spiritualism, see, which the person described in The Raven was a serious seeker of the occult mysteries. See, we see that at the beginning of the poem. And this was all autobiographical for Matthew Franklin Whittier. See, well, if Poe was imagining it, it was false imagination. In other words, it wasn't anything he sincerely believed in. But these early poems are not like that. They're sincerely religious. So there's a disconnect right there. I said, wait a minute, he couldn't have written these. But then I found two of them that actually disagree in their theology or in their beliefs. See, and now this is something that I would know that scholars, in particular scholars with a materialistic bias, would not know. They don't know how to discern between the real thing and a fake. See, I do. I've studied mysticism and I've studied the occult, meaning the paranormal, for some 47, almost 50 years, almost half a century I've studied this. So I'm in a position to be an expert on this topic, whereas most academicians are not. Okay, so I mean, you just have to take that into consideration. Anyway, I'm going to focus on two that clearly have a different background of belief. These are two different poets, and then Poe added his own materialistic revisions. See, so you've got the comparison between the two poems, which don't agree in terms of their assumption about life and the other side. And then you've got Poe, who didn't agree with either of them, who revises it. See, it's a huge smoking gun, in my opinion, because it shows that he was a plagiarist. See, it's proof that he was plagiarizing. Because, as I'll point out, as I'll demonstrate, the same person could not possibly have written these two poems. And Poe, who, when he revises them, could not have written either of them. So what we're going to start with is Tamerlane, one of Poe's earliest productions. This is not the poem, but the book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, which was published in 1827. And I'm looking at the poem called Visit of the Dead. Later on, he revised it and called it The Spirits of the Dead, but this is called Visit of the Dead. And it starts out, well, at least some portion of it here is as follows. I think this is the beginning of the poem, but I may have started partway in. Thy soul shall find itself alone, alone of all on earth, unknown the cause, but none are near to pry into thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude, which is not loneliness, For then the spirits of the dead, who stood in life before thee, are again in death around thee, and their will shall then o'ershadow thee. And it goes on like that. This is a spiritualist. This is somebody who has studied and who knows that when this is like a book of the dead where he's giving instructions to the person who's died. He says, well, first off, you'll find yourself alone and nobody will be able to talk to you or be able to see you. They won't be able to hear you, see? You'll be all alone. But that's not real loneliness, because then the people on the other side in the astral realm are going to come for you, and they will help you and they'll take you back to the other side. This is all things that's known now by people who have studied near-death experiences, for example, and deathbed visions and so on. There's a whole science developing, and all of those facts are known now as they were known then to people who had studied. So Visit of the Dead, included in Tamerlane and Other Poems, was written by a spiritualist who had studied the mysteries. And this was not written by Edgar Allan Poe. It couldn't possibly have been. And we will see why. Because 4 years later, in 1831, we have a book called Poems by Edgar Allan Poe, and in it is a poem entitled Irene. Later on, that became The Sleeper when he revised it. But Irene is a death poem about a woman that is very confused in its theology. And the original gives the impression that the author had this idea that there is a spirit, that kind of hangs around, and it sees that it just doesn't have any more place here on earth. And then it goes to places that it loved in life. And then it kind of becomes a wraith and sinks into the ground to the underworld of a heaven that is uncertain and shadowy. See, well, there's really no basis for that in the genuine teachings. So this person's kind of been exposed to spiritualism and gotten a little bit of it, but he doesn't really understand it, and he's not sure he believes it. That's why he calls it uncertain. I'm going to go ahead and read this couple stanzas here. It's a strange amalgam. The lady sleeps, the dead all sleep, at least as long as love doth weep, meaning you're alive at least as long as people remember you. So here's a materialist right off, or somebody who's profoundly skeptical. Entranced, the spirit loves to lie as long as tears on memory's eye. So there's a spirit, and yet it only lives as long as you remember it. But when a week or two go by, and the light laughter chokes the sigh, indignant from the tomb doth take its way to some remembered lake. In other words, the spirit is pissed off now that people are laughing and forgetting all about it. So it goes to a remembered lake, a place that it used to love, where oft in life with friends it went to bathe in the pure element, take a bath, in other words. And there from the untrodden grass, wreathing for its transparent brow, those flowers that say, ah, hear them now, to the night winds as they pass, aye, aye, alas, alas, pours for a moment ere it go, on the clear waters there that flow. So the spirit has gone back to the lake where she used to bathe. Then sinks within, weighed down by woe, the uncertain, shadowy heaven below. So now the spirit sinks into an uncertain, shadowy heaven, see, which is BS, from the point of view of anybody who's studied. And he continues, the lady sleeps. Oh, may her sleep as it is lasting, so be deep. No icy worms about her creep. I pray to God that she may lie forever with as calm an eye. That chamber changed for one more holy, that bed for one more melancholy. Well, he's not quite sure what he's saying, but he thinks that the lady's spirit sleeps. So she's a spirit, so there aren't any worms about her, but she's sleeping and forever with a calm eye, see, and she's changed her chamber for one more holy, so she's in some better place, but she's still sleeping forever, see. So she got rid of the worms, but that's about as much as you can say for it. Well, that poem was not written by the author of the first poem, because the first poem evinces real study. I don't want to be too redundant here, but I'm trying to drive a point home. And the second one evinces somebody who's quite confused, has studied, in other words, just enough to be dangerous. Now we get into the Saturday Chronicle of May 22nd, 1841. I'm getting this from the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, which is a wonderful source, except that they've got everything wrong. But other than that, they've done a lot of homework and they've got one heck of a resource online. So he's now renamed this in 1841. He's renamed it The Sleeper. And coming down to the relevant paragraph, let's see, how far up do I want to go? He says, "The lady sleeps, oh, may her sleep, which is enduring, so be deep. Soft may the worms about her creep." Now she's physical and the worms are softly creeping. See, before we'd gotten rid of the worms. "This bed being changed for one more holy, this room for one more melancholy." So he's left in the previous guy's lines about the fact that she's changed her room for one more holy. But now she's still physical because the worms are softly creeping around, whereas the previous guy had at least gotten rid of the worms. It says, "I pray to God that she may lie forever with unclosed eye." So now she's forever lying physically with the softly worms creeping around with her eyes open, staring into space. But then he says, "My love, she sleeps. Oh, may her sleep, as it is lasting, so be deep. Heaven have her in its sacred keep." So he don't know what the hell he's talking about, because he's got her physical with the worms. Her eyes are open, but she's sleeping forever, and heaven has her in its sacred keep. Well, heaven isn't very sacred if these eyes are wide open and she's sleeping and the worms are crawling around. So he's not even thinking about what he's writing. It's strictly for effect. See, so he's taken a confused poem and totally garbled it, but he's not finished yet, because the sleeper undergoes yet another metamorphosis in the Philadelphia Saturday Museum of February 25, 1843, in which we read, "The lady sleeps, oh, may her sleep, which is enduring, so be deep. Heaven have her in its sacred keep. This chamber changed for one more holy," still got these two lines, "this bed for one more melancholy." And then he says, "I pray to God that she may lie forever with unopened eye." At least thank God he's closed her eyes. Then he says, "while the dim-sheeted ghosts go by." So now she's lying there physically with her eyes closed, thank God, sleeping forever, but the ghosts are flying around. So Poe has not studied. He has no idea what he's talking about, and he doesn't care. Those first two poems could not have been written by the same person, and Poe could not have written either of them. So the man is a flagrant plagiarist. And again, I went through these carefully with the logic that he was not spiritual, he was not devotional, he was not sincerely a Christian, and any sincere reference to God or religion or spirituality could not possibly be him. And I eliminated about 90% of the poems. They couldn't possibly be his. That means that he's a massive plagiarist, so massive that you really can't get much of a sense of what he wrote at all. Because if he stole as much of his prose as he stole of his poetry, you really can't get a beat on a person like that. It's very difficult. You'd have to look for the worst pieces in his entire legacy and assign those to him. By definition, the plagiarist's worst work is probably his. Otherwise, he would be writing his own. See, so somebody that plagiarizes 90% of his work, that means his reputation was entirely phony, that he was an imposter. And this is where I get that. I'm not just slinging mud. This is logical. It follows logically from all the research I've done, particularly on Matthew, but the research I've done on Edgar Allan Poe, it just follows logically. He had to have been an imposter. See? And if he was that big of a phony, he had to have been a sociopath, because it's sociopaths that tell the big lie. See? So if he was a sociopath, that means that the people that criticized him were probably right. And that instead of being dismissed as crackpots, they should be listened to and taken seriously. And if the people that criticized him, including Matthew, are taken seriously, then, like I said, he's an imposter. then you start looking for, well, who really wrote this stuff? And what did it look like before Poe got hold of it? Well, I can answer those questions with regard to the pieces that Poe stole. Thankfully, The Raven was hardly modified at all by Edgar Allan Poe because Matthew had published it himself in American Review under a pseudonym which was very plausible for him, Blank Quarles, which I think meant Abby Quarles, and I think it was a pun, on Abby. And I think it was specifically meant to dedicate the poem to Abby. The only thing that Poe changed substantially was he changed sublunary being to living human being. And I just found another reference in Matthew's works yesterday in one of his novels to the word sublunary. So Matthew used sublunary at least 23 times in the course of his career. He loved it. I really think that it was something that he and Abby used to joke about together, that they used it together. So he took a word that was part of their private couples lore, and used it in the poem, as another little tribute to her, along with the purple curtains and the purple velvet cushion. All of the things were references to Abby, secret references to her. That's about all I really wanted to present. That took a lot less time than I thought it would. It's just so obvious. This is logic, friends. This is not wild speculation at all. The problem is you have to be a spiritual person. You have to be able to discern what's truly spiritual teachings from what's nonsense. You have to be able to discern spirituality and the real teachings from materialistic BS, see? And most scholars are materialists and they can't discern it. Again, I've had almost 50 years of study into this field, and I can discern it. And I will tell you that The Raven was written by someone who was having a faith crisis, who was deeply studied in the mysteries, and who was in fact studying them when the real actual events of the poem took place, and not by Edgar Allan Poe, the materialist sociopath who stole it.